Caleb Mason spent his last $14 on an abandoned farmhouse and found a wild Mustang living inside the bedroom, its silver coat gleaming in the shadows like a ghost made flesh. The horse's eyes held something he'd never seen before. Not fear, not aggression, but a challenge that would either save his life or destroy everything he'd gambled on. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The $14 in Caleb Mason's pocket represented everything he owned in the world, and even that felt like a fortune he didn't deserve. He stood at the edge of what used to be the Henderson property, staring at the sagging farmhouse that the bank had finally given up trying to sell, and wondered if desperation had finally driven him completely mad. The structure leaned slightly to the left, as if the Wyoming wind had spent the last decade trying to push it over, and the roof showed more gaps than shingles. But it was shelter, and for a man who had spent the last 3 months sleeping in barns and under bridges, even a wreck like this seemed like a palace. The banker, a portly man named Silas Crow, had laughed when Caleb offered the $14. It wasn't a kind laugh, but the sort that came from a man who found amusement in the struggles of those less fortunate. $14 for 40 acres and a house, Crow had repeated, shaking his head. Son, this property's been sitting empty for 7 years. The Henderson family died of fever back in 1891, and nobody's wanted to touch it since. Folks say it's cursed, haunted by old man Henderson's ghost. But I suppose if you're fool enough to want it, and if $14 is all you've got, then it's yours. The bank just wants it off the books. Caleb had signed the papers with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear of ghosts, but from the overwhelming reality that he now owned land. At 28 years old, he had worked as a ranch hand, a cattle driver, a stable boy, and half a dozen other jobs that paid just enough to keep him fed and moving. He had never owned anything beyond the clothes on his back, his father's old saddle, and the aging mare named Dusty, who had carried him faithfully for the past 5 years. The horse stood behind him now, head down against the autumn wind, as unimpressed with their new home as any sensible creature would be. Before we go any further, tell us where you're watching from today. And if this story of second chances and unexpected discoveries speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed, because we've got something special planned for tomorrow. The approaching sunset painted the prairie in shades of amber and gold, and Caleb knew he needed to get inside before darkness fell completely. The walk from town had taken most of the afternoon, and his stomach reminded him that the heel of bread he'd eaten at dawn was long gone. He gathered Dusty's reins and led her toward the barn, another structure that looked like it might collapse if he sneezed too hard. The barn door hung at an angle, one hinge completely rusted through. He pulled it open slowly, wincing at the shriek of protesting metal, and peered into the gloom. The interior was surprisingly intact, with stalls that still had their gates and a hayloft that seemed solid enough. There was even some old hay scattered in the corners, though it was dusty and probably full of mice. He led Dusty inside, unsaddled her with practiced efficiency, and promised her he would find better feed tomorrow. The mare snorted softly, her breath steaming in the cooling air, and settled into one of the stalls as if she had been living there for years. With his horse secure, Caleb turned his attention to the house itself. The front porch groaned under his weight, and he stepped carefully, testing each board before trusting it with his full weight. The door was unlocked, or more accurately, the lock had rusted away to nothing, and it swung open with a sound like a dying animal. The smell that hit him was a mixture of dust, decay, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Something wild and alive that seemed out of place in an abandoned building. The main room had been a kitchen and living area combined, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and a rough wooden table still standing in the center. Broken dishes littered the floor, and the remains of curtains hung in tatters at the windows. Caleb could see the shapes of furniture under layers of dirt and cobwebs, chairs overturned, a rocking chair in the corner that swayed slightly in the draft from the open door. It was clear that when the Henderson family died, their possessions had simply been left to rot. Nobody had wanted to come here to touch the belongings of the dead. He moved through the house slowly, his boots loud on the wooden floors. There were 2 bedrooms off the main room, both in similar states of abandonment. In the larger bedroom, he found a bed frame with the remnants of a mattress that mice had turned into a nest. The smaller bedroom, probably meant for children, held a single narrow cot and a trunk that had been gnawed open by rodents. Everything spoke of lives interrupted, of a family that had expected to return to these rooms but never did. The stairs to the upper floor were rickety, and Caleb tested each one carefully before climbing. The second floor was mostly one large room under the eaves, probably used for storage, and it was here that he found the first signs that someone or something had been in the house recently. The dust was disturbed in places, tracks that looked almost like hoofprints crossing the floor. He frowned, studying them in the fading light that came through gaps in the roof. Hoofprints made no sense. How would a horse get to the second floor of a house? He was about to dismiss it as a trick of the light when he heard it, a sound from somewhere below that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was a whinny, high and wild, definitely equine, but unlike any horse sound he had ever heard. It carried a note of challenge, of warning, and something else that might have been loneliness. Caleb's hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt, his only weapon, and he moved carefully toward the stairs. Whatever was down there, it wasn't a ghost. But as he descended into the gathering darkness of the abandoned farmhouse he had just bought for $14, Caleb Mason had the distinct feeling that he was about to discover his life had just become far more complicated than he ever could have imagined. Caleb moved down the stairs with the caution of a man approaching a rattlesnake, each step deliberate and quiet despite the protesting creak of old wood beneath his boots. The whinny came again, closer now, emanating from what he thought was the larger bedroom. His mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Wild horses sometimes sought shelter in abandoned buildings during harsh weather, but they didn't climb stairs, and they certainly didn't stay once they heard human footsteps approaching. The bedroom door stood partially open, and through the gap he could see movement, shadow against shadow in the dimness. He pushed the door wider, and what he saw in that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. Standing in the center of the room, surrounded by broken furniture and years of accumulated debris, was a horse unlike any he had ever seen. It was a Mustang. That much was clear from the compact, powerful build and the wild intelligence in its eyes. But this was no ordinary range horse. The animal's coat seemed to shimmer even in the poor light, a blue-gray dappled pattern that reminded Caleb of storm clouds rolling across a summer sky. Its mane and tail were almost black, long and flowing, clearly untouched by human hands for years, if ever. The horse stood perhaps 15 hands high, smaller than the big ranch horses Caleb was used to working with, but there was something about its presence that made it seem larger, more commanding. This was a creature born to run free across open country, and every line of its body spoke of power barely contained. What shocked Caleb most was not the horse's beauty, though it was magnificent, but the fact that it was here at all, inside a bedroom on the ground floor of an abandoned house. The animal's eyes locked onto his, and he saw something there that went beyond the usual wariness of wild horses. There was intelligence, yes, but also something that looked almost like relief, as if the Mustang had been waiting for someone to finally arrive. "How did you get in here?" Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. The horse's ears flicked forward at the sound, but it didn't bolt or rear. Instead, it took a single step toward him, then stopped, as if testing his reaction. Caleb forced himself to remain absolutely still, hardly daring to breathe. He had broken his share of horses over the years, but he had never encountered one that radiated such presence, such untamed magnificence. Slowly, carefully, he scanned the room looking for answers. The window on the far wall caught his attention immediately. It was larger than the others, probably put in to give the bedroom more light, and importantly, it was at ground level due to the slope of the land the house sat on. The window was open, the glass long since broken away, and below it the ground outside had been worn smooth by repeated passage. This was how the Mustang had been getting in and out, using the abandoned house as its own private shelter. But why would a wild horse choose to live inside a human dwelling? Mustangs were creatures of the open range, uncomfortable in confined spaces, always seeking freedom and sky. As Caleb's eyes adjusted further to the dimness, he began to understand. The room offered protection from the brutal Wyoming weather that could turn deadly in minutes. The roof here was mostly intact, keeping out rain and snow. The walls blocked the worst of the prairie wind that could cut through a horse's coat like knives. And perhaps most importantly, the house's isolation meant the Mustang could shelter here without fear of predators or humans. The horse nickered softly, a sound that carried a questioning note, and Caleb realized with a start that the animal was as curious about him as he was about it. This Mustang had claimed the house as its territory, and now a strange human had arrived to challenge that claim. Yet instead of attacking or fleeing, the horse waited, watching, as if willing to consider the possibility of coexistence. "I bought this place," Caleb said quietly, keeping his voice low and soothing. "Paid $14 for it, which is everything I have. I don't suppose you'd be willing to share." The absurdity of negotiating with a horse struck him, but he had learned long ago that animals responded more to tone than words. The Mustang's ears swiveled, tracking his voice, and it took another step closer. Caleb could see now that the horse was a mare, probably around 6 or 7 years old in her prime. Her coat, despite the wildness of her living situation, looked surprisingly healthy, and her eyes were clear and bright. He remained motionless as she approached, letting her set the pace. She stretched her neck toward him, nostrils flaring as she took in his scent. He could smell her too, the warm horse smell mixed with prairie grass and something wild and free that no domestic animal ever carried. Her nose touched his outstretched hand for just a moment, soft as velvet, and then she pulled back, apparently satisfied that he posed no immediate threat. "This is going to be interesting," Caleb murmured. He had come here expecting nothing more than a roof over his head and a chance to start over. Instead, he had inherited a wild Mustang with a taste for indoor living and an attitude that suggested she had no intention of being driven away from the home she had claimed. The question was what he was going to do about it. He needed the house, all of it, if he was going to survive the winter. But looking at the magnificent creature standing before him, Caleb found he couldn't imagine forcing her out into the autumn cold. The light was fading fast now, and practical concerns reasserted themselves. He needed to start a fire in the fireplace, if there was one that still worked, find something to eat, and figure out sleeping arrangements that didn't involve sharing a bedroom with a wild horse. But first he needed to establish some kind of understanding with his unexpected roommate. "Listen," he said, addressing the mare as if she could understand every word. "I need this house, and you've clearly been living here for a while. Maybe we can work something out. You keep to your room, I'll keep to mine, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." The mare snorted, a sound that could have meant anything from agreement to dismissal, and moved back toward the open window. For a moment, Caleb thought she was leaving, but instead she simply positioned herself where she could watch both him and her escape route. Caleb backed out of the bedroom slowly, giving the mare space and making it clear he wasn't going to challenge her claim to the room. He pulled the door mostly closed behind him, leaving it open just enough that she wouldn't feel trapped, and returned to the main living area. The fireplace was his first priority. Without heat, the house would be uninhabitable within hours once the sun fully set, and the prairie cold crept in through every crack and gap in the walls. He knelt before the massive stone hearth and examined it in the fading light. Years of abandonment had left it filled with debris, old nests built by birds and small animals, leaves blown in during countless storms, and a layer of soot and ash that spoke of fires long cold. But the structure itself seemed sound, and when he looked up the chimney, he could see a patch of darkening sky, which meant it wasn't blocked. That was something at least. Using his hands and a broken piece of wood, he cleared out the worst of the debris, piling it near the door to be disposed of later. The work was dirty and his hands were soon black with soot, but it felt good to be doing something practical, something that would make this wreck of a house marginally more livable. As he worked, he kept one ear tuned to the bedroom, listening for sounds that would tell him if the Mustang was settling or preparing to bolt. What he heard instead was the soft shuffling of hooves on wood, the occasional snort, and once a sound that might have been the mare lying down. With the fireplace cleared, Caleb ventured back outside to gather wood. The property had a small stand of cottonwoods near what had once been a creek, but was now just a dry bed of stones. Dead branches littered the ground beneath them, and he gathered an armful, testing each piece to make sure it was dry enough to burn. The evening air had turned sharp, carrying the promise of frost, and he hurried back to the house with his burden. Starting a fire with the few matches he had left in his pocket was a nerve-wracking process. Each match was precious, and he couldn't afford to waste them. He arranged the smallest twigs in a careful pyramid, added some dried grass he found near the door, and struck his first match. The flame caught on the third try, and he nursed it carefully, adding larger pieces of wood as the fire grew. Soon he had a respectable blaze going, and the warmth began to push back the cold that had settled into the house's bones. The firelight transformed the room, chasing shadows into corners and revealing details he hadn't noticed before. The table was solid oak, scarred and dirty, but well made. One of the overturned chairs was actually in decent condition, and he righted it, wiping off the worst of the dust with his sleeve. The rocking chair in the corner had been beautiful once, carved with intricate designs, though mice had chewed through part of the seat. Still, these were furnishings, and they spoke of a life that had been lived here, a family that had made this place a home. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since dawn. His saddlebags, still in the barn with Dusty, contained the sum total of his provisions, which wasn't much. A small sack of cornmeal, some jerky that was more leather than meat, and half a loaf of bread that had seen better days. It would have to do. He retrieved the bags from the barn, checking on Dusty as he did. The old mare seemed content enough, and he promised her again that tomorrow would bring better arrangements. Back in the house, he mixed some of the cornmeal with water from his canteen and formed it into rough cakes that he cooked on a flat stone he positioned in the fireplace. They weren't much to look at and tasted even worse, but they were hot and filling, and that was all that mattered. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, and washed it down with the last of his water. Tomorrow, he would need to find a source of fresh water, another task added to the growing list of things this property required. As he ate, he became aware that he was being watched. The bedroom door had opened wider, and the Mustang stood in the doorway, her head extended into the main room, her nostrils working as she caught the scent of his cooking. Caleb froze, cornmeal cake halfway to his mouth, and met the mare's eyes. They regarded each other for a long moment, man and horse, both strangers in a house that belonged to neither of them by any right, except possession and need. "You hungry?" Caleb asked softly. "I don't have much, but you're welcome to share." He broke off a piece of the cornmeal cake and held it out on his palm, his arm extended but not reaching toward her, letting her decide whether to approach. The mare's ears flicked forward, and she took a tentative step into the room, then another. Her hooves clicked softly on the wooden floor, and Caleb marveled at how such a powerful animal could move with such delicate precision. She stretched her neck toward his outstretched hand, and he felt the soft touch of her muzzle against his palm as she lipped up the piece of cornmeal cake. She chewed thoughtfully, and Caleb could have sworn he saw disappointment in her expression when she finished. "Not exactly gourmet dining," he admitted, "but it's what I've got." The mare snorted, a sound that seemed to express agreement with his assessment, and then did something that surprised him. Instead of retreating to her bedroom, she moved closer to the fire, lowering her head to investigate the warmth. Caleb remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Wild horses didn't approach humans like this, didn't willingly enter enclosed spaces where they could be trapped. Yet here was this magnificent Mustang standing less than 6 feet from him, seemingly as interested in the fire's warmth as he was. It occurred to him that perhaps she wasn't entirely wild, that maybe somewhere in her past there had been human contact, gentling that hadn't quite taken but had left her less fearful than a truly feral horse would be. Or maybe, he thought, watching the firelight play across her dappled coat, maybe she was just lonely. 7 years this house had stood empty. 7 years she might have been living here, sheltering from storms and predators and the harsh reality of survival on the open range. 7 years of solitude would make anyone desperate for companionship, even if that companion was a broke cowboy with nothing but $14 and dreams of a fresh start. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards and whistling through the gaps in the walls. But inside, in the circle of firelight, a tentative peace had been established. Caleb finished his meager meal and settled back in the chair, watching the flames and stealing glances at the mare who had claimed a spot near the hearth. She stood with one hip cocked, her head lowered, her eyes half closed in a posture that spoke of relaxation, of trust, or at least of temporary acceptance. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't yet imagine. He needed to repair the house, find steady work, figure out how to survive the coming winter with nothing but hope and determination. But tonight, in this moment, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. He felt like he had come home. Caleb woke to the sound of hoofbeats and the gray light of dawn filtering through the broken windows. For a moment, disoriented by sleep and unfamiliar surroundings, he couldn't remember where he was. Then memory returned, along with the ache in his back from sleeping in a chair by a dead fire, and he sat up quickly, looking for the Mustang. The bedroom door stood open, and through the window he could see her outside, moving across the overgrown yard, with the fluid grace of water flowing downhill. He stood and stretched, his joints protesting the night spent in the uncomfortable chair. The house was cold, the fire having died sometime in the early morning hours, and his breath misted in the air. Through the window, he watched the mare as she grazed on the tough prairie grass, her coat gleaming in the early light. She looked different out there in the open, wilder and more elemental, and he wondered if she would even acknowledge him when he stepped outside, or if the tentative connection they had made by firelight would evaporate with the morning. There was only one way to find out. He splashed his face with water from his canteen, ran his fingers through his hair in a futile attempt to make himself presentable, and stepped out onto the creaking porch. The mare's head came up immediately, her ears swiveling toward him, and for a heartbeat he thought she would bolt. Instead, she returned to grazing, though he noticed she had positioned herself between him and the open prairie, as if keeping her escape route clear. "Good morning to you too," Caleb called softly. The mare's tail swished, which he chose to interpret as acknowledgement. He had more pressing concerns than hurt feelings from a horse. Dusty needed attention, the property needed exploration, and he needed to figure out where he was going to find fresh water. The canteen was nearly empty, and he couldn't survive long without a reliable source. He made his way to the barn, moving slowly so as not to spook the Mustang, though she seemed content to ignore him now. Dusty greeted him with a soft nicker, clearly hoping for breakfast. "I know, old girl," Caleb murmured, stroking her neck. "I'm working on it." He led her out of the barn into the morning sunlight, and immediately the Mustang's demeanor changed. Her head came up sharply, her nostrils flared, and she moved toward them with purposeful strides. Caleb's hand went instinctively to Dusty's halter, ready to protect his loyal mare from whatever the wild horse had in mind. But as the Mustang approached, he realized there was no aggression in her posture. If anything, she seemed curious, perhaps even eager. The two horses touched noses, breathing in each other's scent in the age-old equine greeting, and Dusty nickered softly. The Mustang circled them once, then twice, as if inspecting this newcomer to her territory. "Well, that's a relief," Caleb said, relaxing slightly. "Looks like you two are going to get along." The Mustang snorted and trotted off a short distance, then stopped and looked back at them, her posture suggesting expectation. Caleb frowned, trying to interpret the behavior. The mare whinnied, a high, clear sound that carried across the prairie, and pawed at the ground. Then she set off at a trot toward the northern edge of the property, still looking back at them. "She wants us to follow her," Caleb realized with a start. But why would a wild horse want to lead humans anywhere? There was only one way to find out. He swung up onto Dusty's bare back, something he had done 1,000 times, and urged the old mare forward. The Mustang waited until they were following, then continued on, setting a pace that was easy to match. She led them across the property, past the ruins of what had once been a chicken coop, around the dry creek bed, and up a gentle rise that Caleb hadn't yet explored. At the top of the rise, the Mustang stopped and nickered again, this time with what sounded like satisfaction. Caleb guided Dusty up beside her and felt his heart lift at what he saw. There, hidden in a small depression on the far side of the rise, was a spring. Water bubbled up from between rocks, clear and cold, forming a small pool before trickling away into the ground. Grass grew thick and green around it, fed by the constant moisture, and the ground was marked with hoof prints showing this was where the Mustang came to drink. "She showed us the water," Caleb said aloud, his voice filled with wonder. He slid off Dusty's back and knelt beside the spring, cupping his hands and bringing the water to his lips. It was cold enough to make his teeth ache and tasted of minerals and stone and life itself. He drank deeply, then filled his canteen while both horses moved to the pool to drink. The Mustang watched him the entire time, and in her eyes he saw something that looked like approval. "Thank you," he said to her, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Water was life out here on the prairie, and she had just shown him the key to survival. The mare bobbed her head as if acknowledging his gratitude, then moved away to graze on the lush grass around the spring. Caleb sat back on his heels watching her, and felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. This horse wasn't just sheltering in the abandoned house. She had made the entire property her territory, knew every inch of it, including resources that someone new to the land would take days or weeks to discover. She had been living here for years, surviving, adapting, making the best of an abandoned place that no one else wanted. In a way, he realized, they weren't so different. Both of them were survivors. Both had claimed this property because they had nowhere else to go, and both were trying to carve out an existence in a world that hadn't made things easy. The difference was that she had been here first, and unlike most humans, Caleb was willing to acknowledge that fact. Over the next few hours, as the morning warmed and the sun climbed higher, Caleb explored his new property with fresh eyes. The 40 acres were a mixture of prairie grassland and rocky outcroppings, not prime farming land by any measure, but sufficient for grazing if he could get his hands on a few head of cattle or sheep. The barn, while in poor repair, had good bones and could be fixed with time and effort. There was even an old root cellar near the house, half filled with dirt but still structurally sound. The Mustang followed at a distance, sometimes visible on the edge of his vision, sometimes disappearing entirely, only to reappear when he least expected it. She was like a ghost, he thought, haunting the property she had claimed as her own. But ghosts didn't show you where to find water, and they didn't stand by the fire seeking warmth and company. Whatever else she might be, this horse was very much alive, and very much a presence he was going to have to account for in his plans. By midday, Caleb had returned to the house with a clearer picture of what he was facing. The property had potential, but realizing that potential would take work, time, and resources he didn't currently possess. He needed tools, lumber, nails, glass for the windows, proper food supplies, and a dozen other things that cost money he didn't have. His $14 was gone, spent on the property itself, and he was going to need to find work soon if he wanted to eat regularly. The nearest town was Pine Bluff, a 2-hour ride on Dusty, and he knew from his brief time there that jobs were scarce. The big ranches employed most of the available hands, and they weren't hiring this late in the season. But maybe he could find odd jobs, day labor, something to keep him going until spring when opportunities might open up. The thought of leaving the property, even for a day, bothered him more than it should have. He told himself it was concern about the house, about potential thieves or vandals, but deep down he knew it was about the mare. She had shown him the water. She had accepted his presence. In her own wild way, she had welcomed him to the property they now shared. Leaving felt like abandoning a trust that was just beginning to form. But practical necessity outweighed sentiment. He needed supplies, and that meant he needed money, and that meant he needed work. He would ride to Pine Bluff tomorrow and see what opportunities might present themselves. The decision to leave for Pine Bluff came with an unexpected complication. As Caleb saddled Dusty in the early morning light, preparing for the 2-hour ride to town, the Mustang appeared from around the side of the barn. She stood watching him with those intelligent eyes, and there was something in her posture that he couldn't quite interpret. It wasn't fear or aggression, but something closer to concern, or perhaps curiosity about what he was doing. "Just going to town," he explained, feeling foolish for talking to a wild horse as if she could understand. "Need to find work, get some supplies. I'll be back before dark." The mare pawed at the ground and tossed her head, her mane flowing like dark water. Then she did something that took his breath away. She moved to position herself beside Dusty, matching the old mare's stance, as if she intended to come along. "Oh no," Caleb said quickly. "You can't come with me to town. You're wild, remember? People see a Mustang like you, they'll want to catch you, break you, sell you, you're safer here." But even as he spoke, he realized the problem with his reasoning. The mare had survived for years on this property precisely because she knew when to stay hidden and when to venture out. She had shown more intelligence and judgment in one day than many horses he'd known displayed in their entire lives. Still, taking a wild horse to town was asking for trouble. He mounted Dusty and turned her toward the road, expecting the Mustang to remain behind. Instead, she followed, keeping pace with them as they set off across the prairie. Caleb tried shooing her away, waving his arms and making loud noises, but she simply moved back a few yards and continued following. When he stopped, she stopped. When he started again, she started again. It was clear she had made up her mind to accompany them, and nothing he did was going to change that. "Fine," Caleb said with resignation. "But you stay back when we get close to town, you hear me? I won't have you getting roped and dragged off to some ranch where they'll break your spirit." The mare snorted, a sound that could have meant anything, and continued following at a respectful distance. The journey to Pine Bluff took them across open prairie, past several small ranches, and through terrain that varied from flat grassland to rolling hills dotted with scrub pine. Throughout the ride, The Mustang maintained her position behind them, sometimes visible, sometimes disappearing into dips and valleys, but always returning. Caleb found himself constantly looking back to check on her, and he realized with surprise that he was starting to think of her as part of his small household. She wasn't a pet, certainly wasn't domesticated in any traditional sense, but she wasn't entirely wild anymore either. She existed in some liminal space between the two states, choosing to associate with him while maintaining her independence and freedom. It was an unusual arrangement, but then again, everything about his current situation was unusual. As they drew closer to Pine Bluff, Caleb's concerns about the mayor's presence grew more pressing. The town was visible now, a collection of wooden buildings strung along the main road, with the church steeple rising above the rest, like a finger pointing at heaven. He turned in the saddle and looked back at the Mustang, who had stopped on a rise about a quarter-mile behind them. "Stay there," he called, knowing she probably wouldn't understand, but feeling the need to say it anyway. "I mean it. Don't come any closer." The mare stood motionless on the rise, her form silhouetted against the morning sky, and Caleb could have sworn she understood exactly what he was asking. He touched his heels to Dusty's sides and rode the rest of the way into town, glancing back frequently to make sure the Mustang remained where she was. Pine Bluff was not a large town, maybe 200 souls on a busy day, but it had the essentials: a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a boarding house, and the bank where Silas Crow held court over the financial destinies of everyone foolish enough to need his services. Caleb hitched Dusty outside the general store and went inside, hoping to find leads on work before his stomach started demanding food he couldn't afford. The proprietor, a weathered man named August Brennan, looked up from the counter where he was inventorying canned goods. Caleb recognized him from his previous visit, though they hadn't spoken beyond basic pleasantries. "Morning," Brennan said, his tone neutral. "You're that fellow bought the old Henderson place, aren't you? Word traveled fast in small towns." Caleb nodded. "That's right. I was wondering if you knew of any work around town. Day labor, odd jobs, anything that pays." Brennan scratched his jaw thoughtfully. "Most of the ranches are done hiring for the season. You might try the Rocking M Ranch about 8 miles west. Old man Mitchell sometimes needs help with fence repair this time of year. Other than that," he shrugged, "might be slim pickings until spring." Caleb thanked him and was turning to leave when the door opened and a woman entered. She was perhaps 40, dressed in the practical clothing of a rancher's wife, with eyes that assessed him quickly and thoroughly. "You're looking for work," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb replied, removing his hat respectfully. The woman nodded. "I'm Sarah Mitchell from the Rocking M. My husband could use an extra hand for a few days. We're moving cattle to the south pasture, and 2 of our regular hands quit to try their luck in the silver mines. It's hard work, but it pays $1 a day plus meals." When Caleb's face lit up, she added, "You can start tomorrow if you're willing." "More than willing," Caleb said quickly. $1 a day was better than he'd dared hope. "Thank you, ma'am. This is a real blessing." "Don't thank me yet," Sarah Mitchell said with a slight smile. "You haven't met the cattle. They're ornery as sin and twice as stubborn. Be at the ranch at dawn tomorrow. We're burning daylight as it is." She gave him directions, purchased her supplies from Brennan, and left as efficiently as she had arrived. Caleb stood in the store, hardly believing his luck. 4 or 5 days of work would give him enough money to buy essential supplies and maybe even a few head of chickens to start his own small operation. He spent the next few hours walking through town, introducing himself to the blacksmith, the livery owner, and several other businessmen who might need occasional labor. By the time the sun reached its zenith, he had 3 promises of possible future work and 1 definite job starting tomorrow. It wasn't wealth, but it was a start, and that was more than he'd had when he woke up that morning. He bought a small sack of oats for Dusty and the Mustang with the last coins in his pocket, splurging on something he could barely afford because both horses had earned it. The ride back to the property was pleasant in the afternoon warmth. True to his hopes, the Mustang was waiting on the same rise where he'd last seen her, and she fell into step behind them as naturally as if they'd been traveling together for years. Caleb found himself telling her about his good fortune, about the job at the Rocking M, about the possibilities that were opening up. The mare's ears swiveled as he talked, and he chose to believe she was listening. When they reached the spring, Caleb divided the oats between both horses, pouring Dusty's portion into his hat and scattering the Mustangs on the ground near the water. The mare approached cautiously, sniffed the oats, and then ate with obvious enjoyment. It was a small thing, sharing grain with a wild horse, but it felt significant somehow, like another step in the strange partnership they were forming. Caleb woke before dawn the next morning, his body already anticipating the hard work ahead. The fire had died again during the night, and the house was cold enough that his breath formed clouds in the air. He dressed quickly, pulling on his worn work shirt and the leather vest that had seen him through 3 winters already. As he stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness, he found the Mustang waiting near the porch, her coat silvery in the faint light from the stars. "You're up early," he said softly. The mare nickered in response, and he could see her breath misting in the cold air. He saddled Dusty by touch more than sight, his hands knowing the work so well they didn't need eyes to guide them. The Mustang watched the entire process, and when he mounted up and turned Dusty toward the road, she fell into step behind them without hesitation. Caleb didn't have the heart to tell her to stay behind. If she wanted to follow, he wasn't going to stop her. The ride to the Rocking M took just over an hour, and they arrived as the sun was painting the eastern horizon in shades of rose and gold. The ranch was substantial, with a large barn, several corrals, and a main house that spoke of prosperity and careful management. Caleb could see cattle in the distance, dark shapes moving against the lightening sky, and the sight made his palms itch with anticipation. This was honest work, the kind he understood and was good at. He hitched Dusty at the rail near the barn and was walking toward the main house when a voice called out from behind him. "That's a fine-looking mare you've got following you." Caleb turned to find a man who could only be Mr. Mitchell emerging from the barn. He was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life working outdoors and eyes that missed nothing. That's the Mustang his wife had mentioned, standing a respectful distance away, but clearly visible in the growing light. "She's not mine," Caleb said quickly. "She lives on the property I bought, the old Henderson place. She just follows sometimes, can't seem to stop her." Mitchell moved closer to get a better look at the mare, and Caleb tensed, ready to intervene if the rancher tried to rope her. But Mitchell simply observed, his experienced eye taking in her conformation, her bearing, and the way she held herself with one foot cocked, relaxed but alert. "That's a blue roan," Mitchell said with appreciation in his voice. "Good bloodlines if I'm any judge. She's got the look of those Mustang herds that used to run the high country before most of them got rounded up. You planning to break her?" Caleb shook his head. "She's wild, and I figure she's earned the right to stay that way. We have an understanding of sorts. She uses the house for shelter, and I don't try to change what she is." Mitchell studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's an unusual philosophy, but I respect it. Most men would see dollar signs looking at a horse like that. Well, come on then. We're burning daylight, and those cattle won't move themselves." The work that day was exactly as hard as Sarah Mitchell had promised. The cattle were ornery, scattered across terrain that made gathering them a constant challenge, and the weather turned from crisp and clear to cold and threatening by mid-morning. But Caleb threw himself into the work with determination, proving his worth with every passing hour. He wasn't the only hired hand. The Mitchells had 2 regular cowboys, Men named Pete and Carson who had been with the ranch for years, and they watched him with the suspicion that permanent hands always showed toward temporary help. But by noon, when they stopped to eat the lunches Sarah Mitchell had packed, even Pete was grudgingly admitting that Caleb knew his way around cattle. "You handle yourself pretty well," Pete said around a mouthful of sandwich. "Where'd you learn to work livestock?" "Here and there," Caleb replied, not wanting to go into the long list of ranches and outfits he'd worked for over the years. "I've been moving around since I was 15. This is the first place I've ever owned, even if it is falling down around my ears." Carson, the quieter of the two regular hands, gestured toward the ridge where the Mustang had stationed herself, visible against the sky. "That mare really just follows you around?" "She does," Caleb confirmed. "Started the day I moved in. I think she was lonely, and now she's decided we're some kind of herd." The afternoon brought harder work as they pushed the cattle toward the south pasture, fighting the animals' natural tendency to scatter and their apparent determination to go anywhere except where they were being driven. Caleb's arms ached from holding his rope, his legs were sore from hours in the saddle, and dust coated every inch of him until he looked like he'd been carved from prairie clay. But there was satisfaction in the work, in successfully moving the herd, in earning his pay through honest labor. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, and Caleb was exhausted. Mr. Mitchell paid him his dollar in coins that felt heavy and precious in his palm, and Sarah insisted he take some leftover biscuits and salt pork for his dinner. "You did good work today," Mitchell said as Caleb prepared to leave. "Come back tomorrow, same time. We'll finish moving the rest of the herd." Caleb agreed gratefully and mounted Dusty for the ride home. The Mustang materialized from the gathering darkness as if she'd been waiting for him, and Caleb found himself smiling despite his exhaustion. "Did you have a good day too?" he asked her. "Find some interesting grass to eat, maybe some other horses to visit." The mare snorted and tossed her head, and for a moment, Caleb could have sworn she was laughing at him. They rode home together through the purple twilight, and Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of being exactly where he was supposed to be. Back at the property, he tended to Dusty first, rubbing her down thoroughly and making sure she had water from the spring. The Mustang watched from nearby, and when he was done with Dusty, he approached her slowly, his hand extended. She allowed him to touch her neck, just briefly, her coat warm and soft under his calloused palm. It was progress, small but real, and it filled him with quiet joy. Inside the house, he relit the fire and heated the salt pork in his small pan, eating it with the biscuits Sarah had given him. The meal was simple but satisfying, and as he ate, the Mustang appeared in the doorway of her bedroom, watching him with those intelligent eyes. He tossed her a piece of biscuit, which she caught and ate delicately. "This is becoming a habit, you know," Caleb said. "Pretty soon you'll be expecting 3 meals a day and breakfast in bed." The mare bobbed her head as if agreeing, and Caleb laughed, the sound echoing in the mostly empty house. For the first time since leaving his family's farm at 15, running from poverty and his father's disappointment, Caleb felt something like contentment settling over him. The next 4 days established a rhythm that Caleb found himself settling into with surprising ease. Each morning he would wake before dawn, find the Mustang waiting near the porch, and ride to the rocking M with his unusual companion following at a distance. The work was hard but satisfying, and Mr. Mitchell proved to be a fair employer who appreciated competence and didn't waste words on unnecessary conversation. By the end of the 4th day, Caleb had earned $4 more and the respect of Pete and Carson, who had stopped treating him like temporary help and started including him in their easy banter. More importantly, he had learned things about ranching in this particular territory that would serve him well when he finally got his own operation started. Mitchell ran his cattle differently than the big outfits Caleb had worked for in the past, paying attention to grazing patterns and water sources, rotating pastures to prevent overuse. It was smart ranching, sustainable ranching, and Caleb filed away every lesson for future use. On the last day, as Mitchell paid him his final dollar, the rancher made an offer that took Caleb by surprise. "I've been thinking," Mitchell said, leaning against the corral fence. "That Henderson property of yours, it's got potential if you work it right. I've got 3 young steers I was planning to sell for beef, but they're not quite ready for market. What if I loaned them to you for the winter? You pasture them on your land, and come spring we split whatever profit comes from selling them. It would give you a start on your own herd." Caleb stared at him, hardly believing what he was hearing. "That's more than generous, Mr. Mitchell. I don't know what to say." "Say yes before I change my mind," Mitchell replied with a slight smile. "I like to see a young man trying to make something of himself. Besides, your mare following you around every day has been better entertainment than anything we've had around here in months. My wife thinks it's the most romantic thing she's ever seen, a wild horse choosing to stay with a man who respects her freedom." Caleb felt heat rise to his cheeks at the word romantic, but he nodded his agreement. "I'll take good care of them, Mr. Mitchell. You have my word on that." The 3 steers were delivered to his property the next day by Pete and Carson, who helped him reinforce the worst sections of his fence and showed him which areas had the best grazing. The Mustang watched the entire proceeding from her usual observation point on the rise, and Caleb noticed she seemed particularly interested in the new arrivals. That evening, after the ranch hands had left and he was checking on the steers one final time, the mare approached the fence where the cattle were grazing and stood watching them with what looked like satisfaction. "You approve?" Caleb asked, coming to stand beside her. She was allowing him closer now, accepting his presence within a few feet without moving away. He still couldn't touch her freely, but the wariness had faded into something more like companionship. The mare nickered softly, and one of the steers lifted his head to look at her. For a moment, Caleb had the fanciful thought that she was acting as a guardian, protecting this small piece of property that had become home to them both. With steady work completed and money in his pocket, Caleb made a trip to town to purchase supplies. He bought lumber and nails, glass for the windows, a proper axe and saw, flour and beans and coffee, and even a few laying hens that the general store owner was willing to sell cheap. Brennan, warming to him now that he proved to be a paying customer, threw in some chicken wire and fence posts at cost. "You're really planning to make a go of that place, aren't you?" Brennan observed as he tallied up the purchases. "I am," Caleb replied. "It's not much now, but it's mine. First thing I've ever owned that nobody can take away from me." Brennan nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. This territory needs more men willing to build instead of just taking. You need any help getting that lumber out to your place? My boy can drive it out tomorrow with the wagon." Caleb accepted gratefully, and the next day young Tommy Brennan, a gangly 15-year-old, arrived with a wagon full of supplies and eyes wide with curiosity. The boy's excitement grew even more pronounced when the Mustang appeared. Watching from her customary distance as they unloaded the wagon, "Is that really a wild horse?" Tommy asked, his voice hushed with awe. "Sure is," Caleb confirmed. "Lives here on the property. We have an arrangement." Tommy spent the next hour trying to get closer to the mare, moving with the exaggerated stealth of youth while Caleb unpacked supplies and tried not to laugh at the boy's efforts. The Mustang tolerated the attention with patient dignity, staying just out of reach but not fleeing, as if she understood the boy meant no harm. Before Tommy left, he helped Caleb start repairs on the chicken coop, sharing gossip from town as they worked. The most interesting piece of news was that Silas Crow at the bank was asking questions about who had bought the Henderson property and whether the new owner was going to make his taxes come spring. "Daddy says Mr. Crow is hoping you'll fail so he can take the property back and sell it to someone else for more money," Tommy said, hammering nails with more enthusiasm than accuracy. "Says that's how Mr. Crow operates, always looking to profit off other people's misfortune." The information troubled Caleb more than he wanted to admit. He hadn't thought about taxes, hadn't considered that ownership of the property came with ongoing financial obligations. How much would the taxes be? What if he couldn't earn enough by spring to pay them? The thought of losing the property after finally having something of his own made his stomach clench with anxiety. But worrying wouldn't change anything. All he could do was work hard, save what he could, and hope it would be enough. After Tommy left, Caleb threw himself into repairs with renewed determination. He fixed the worst of the gaps in the chicken coop, installed the hens in their new home, and spent the remaining daylight hours replacing broken boards on the porch. The Mustang watched his progress from various vantage points, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always present. As evening approached and Caleb paused to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the autumn chill, she moved closer than she ever had before, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her without extending his arm. He held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The mare stretched her neck toward him, her nose almost touching his chest, and he could feel the warmth of her breath through his shirt. They stood like that for a long moment, man and horse, connected by something that went deeper than words or understanding. Then she pulled back and trotted away toward her bedroom window, leaving Caleb standing alone in the gathering dusk, his heart pounding with an emotion he couldn't quite name. That night, as he sat by the fire eating beans and the fresh bread he'd bought in town, Caleb found himself thinking about trust. The Mustang was learning to trust him, slowly but surely, and he was learning to trust her presence as a constant in his life. But could he trust himself to make this work, to turn a falling down house and 40 acres of rough land into something sustainable? Could he trust that the universe wouldn't yank this opportunity away just when he was starting to believe in it? He didn't have answers to those questions. All he had was determination, a wild horse who had chosen to stay, and the growing conviction that he had found something worth fighting for. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that caught even the old-timers by surprise. The first real storm hit on a November evening when Caleb was still working on reinforcing the barn roof. He had just enough warning, a sudden drop in temperature and a smell in the air that spoke of snow, to get his tools secured and the animals checked before the wind began to howl across the prairie like something alive and angry. The Mustang appeared at the house as the first flakes started to fall, moving through her bedroom window with an urgency Caleb hadn't seen before. She paced the small room, her hooves loud on the wooden floor, and her agitation was palpable. He watched from the doorway, trying to understand what had her so unsettled. Then it hit him. She was used to sheltering in the house during storms, but she'd never had to share the space with a human before. She was torn between the safety she knew and her instinctive wariness of being trapped indoors with him. "It's all right," Caleb said softly, backing away from the door. "I'll stay in the main room. You've got your space, and I've got mine. Remember?" The mare stopped pacing and looked at him, and he could see her processing his words, or at least his tone. After a moment, she moved to her usual spot near the bedroom window and lowered her head, though her ears remained alert, swiveling to track every sound he made in the other room. The storm intensified quickly, wind-driven snow creating a white void beyond the windows that Caleb had so painstakingly repaired. He built up the fire until it roared in the hearth, knowing he would need its warmth to survive the night. The house creaked and groaned under the assault of wind, and he found himself grateful for every board he'd replaced, every gap he'd sealed. Without those repairs, this place would have been uninhabitable. Around midnight, when the storm was at its peak and the temperature had dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the windows, Caleb heard movement from the bedroom. The Mustang appeared in the doorway, her eyes reflecting the firelight like copper coins. She stood there for several minutes, and he could see her shivering despite her thick winter coat. The bedroom, he realized, didn't have a fireplace. She had chosen the room because of the window access. But on a night like this, That window was letting in deadly cold. "Come on," he said gently, patting the floor near the fire. "It's warmer here." For a long moment, the mare didn't move. Then slowly, cautiously, she stepped into the main room. Her hooves clicked on the wood as she crossed the floor, and Caleb held his breath, afraid any movement would spook her. She made her way to the far side of the fireplace, as far from him as she could get, while still benefiting from the heat, and stood with her head low, her body gradually relaxing as warmth seeped into her. They stayed like that for hours, man and horse, sharing the fire's warmth while the storm raged outside. Caleb dozed occasionally, jerking awake each time to make sure the fire hadn't died and that the Mustang was still there. She seemed to be doing the same, her eyes closing for periods before opening again to check on him. It was a vigil they kept together, two survivors making it through the night by virtue of shelter, fire, and the tentative trust they had built. By morning, the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts piled high against the house and barn, and the landscape had become a study in white and gray under a pale sun. Caleb forced the door open against the snow and surveyed the damage. The chicken coop had lost part of its roof, and one section of fence had blown down entirely. The 3 steers huddled against the barn wall, dusted with snow but alive. He would need to dig them out and make sure they had access to water from the spring. The Mustang emerged from the house behind him, stepping carefully into the deep snow. She moved through it with less difficulty than he did, her lighter weight keeping her from sinking as deeply, and she made her way toward the spring with purpose. Caleb followed, breaking trail as best he could, and found the water still flowing despite the cold. Ice had formed around the edges, but the center ran clear and cold, testament to the spring's depth and the warmth of the earth that fed it. Working in the bitter cold, Caleb spent the day repairing storm damage and making sure the animals had food and water. The chickens had survived, huddled together for warmth, but they'd need feed soon. The steers were hungry and thirsty, but otherwise unharmed. Dusty greeted him with reproachful eyes, clearly believing he should have prevented the entire storm. And through it all, the Mustang stayed close, closer than she ever had before, as if the shared night by the fire had created a new level of comfort between them. That evening, exhausted from hours of physical labor in the cold, Caleb collapsed in his chair by the fire with a plate of beans and the last of his bread. The Mustang stood in the doorway of her bedroom watching him. Then, in a gesture that made his throat tighten with emotion, she walked into the main room and lay down on the far side of the fire. It was the first time she had chosen to settle in his presence, and the trust implicit in the action was not lost on him. "You're welcome to stay," he said quietly. "Anytime you want." The mare's ears flicked toward him, and then she rested her head on the floor and closed her eyes. Caleb watched her for a long time, marveling at the journey they'd made from that first startled encounter to this moment of peaceful coexistence. Outside, another storm was building on the horizon, dark clouds promising more snow and wind. But inside, the fire burned warm and steady, and for the first time in his life, Caleb wasn't facing the winter alone. The next week brought 2 more storms, each one testing the repairs he'd made and pushing him to his limits as he struggled to keep the animals fed and the property functioning. Between storms, he made trips to the spring, carrying water in whatever containers he could find, and scattered hay for the steers that he'd purchased from Mitchell's surplus. The chickens stopped laying in the cold, but at least they survived, which was more than many people could say about their livestock in weather like this. Money became a pressing concern. He had spent most of his earnings from the Rocking M on supplies and repairs, and what remained wouldn't last long if winter continued with this intensity. He needed work, but the storms made travel to town impossible, and most ranchers wouldn't be hiring until spring anyway. He found himself counting and recounting his remaining coins, trying to calculate how long they would last if he was careful, and coming up short every time. It was during one of these anxious calculations, sitting at the table with his small pile of money spread before him, that the Mustang approached him closer than she'd ever come while he was sitting down. She stretched her neck over his shoulder, her breath warm against his cheek, and looked at the coins as if she understood what they represented. "You're worried too," Caleb said, not really a question. He reached up slowly, and for the first time stroked her neck without her pulling away. Her coat was thick and soft under his palm, and the simple act of touching her filled him with a sense of peace he desperately needed. The opportunity that would change everything came from an unexpected source. Tommy Brennan arrived at the property on a clear morning in late December, riding his father's sturdy bay and carrying news that had him practically vibrating with excitement. "Mr. Mason," he called out before he'd even dismounted, "my father sent me to find you. There's a man in town looking for someone who can work with difficult horses. He's willing to pay good money." Caleb emerged from the barn, where he'd been mucking out Dusty's stall. His interest immediately piqued. "What kind of difficult horses?" "The kind nobody else wants to deal with," Tommy replied, his eyes drifting to where the Mustang stood watching from her position near the house. "The man's name is Charles Whitmore. Came out from back east with 6 thoroughbreds he's planning to race, but they got spooked bad during the train journey and now they won't let anyone near them. He's desperate, Mr. Mason. Says he'll pay $5 to anyone who can gentle them enough that he can get them to his ranch." $5 was more money than Caleb had seen in one place since buying the property. It was enough to pay his taxes with some left over for supplies. But working with traumatized thoroughbreds was dangerous work, the kind that could get a man killed if he didn't know what he was doing. Still, he'd worked with difficult horses before, and he'd learned patience from the best teachers, the horses themselves. "I'll talk to him," Caleb said. "Where can I find this Mr. Whitmore?" "He's staying at the boarding house." Tommy dismounted and came closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Mr. Mason, people are saying you've done something special with that Mustang, that she follows you around like a dog and lets you touch her even though she's wild. Is it true? Caleb glanced at the mare, who had moved closer during their conversation, her curiosity apparently overcoming her usual caution. "It's true," he admitted. "But it took time and patience. I didn't force anything. I just let her make her own choices." "That's what Mr. Whitmore needs," Tommy said earnestly. "Someone who understands that forcing a scared horse just makes things worse. My father thinks you might be the only person in the territory who can help." The praise from Brennan, who was notoriously stingy with compliments, meant more than Caleb wanted to admit. He saddled Dusty, and with the Mustang following at her customary distance, made the ride to Pine Bluff. Charles Whitmore proved to be a soft-spoken man in his 40s, well-dressed but with worry lines etched deep around his eyes. "The horses are at the livery," Whitmore explained as they walked through town. "The owner has been kind enough to board them, but I can't keep them there indefinitely. They're valuable animals, Mr. Mason, with bloodlines going back to English racing stock. But they're terrified, and terrified horses are dangerous horses. Can you help?" Caleb couldn't make promises about animals he hadn't seen, but he agreed to assess the situation. The livery stable was on the edge of town, a large building that smelled of hay and horses and leather. Inside, in stalls at the far end, were the 6 thoroughbreds. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the problem. The horses were in poor condition despite obvious attempts at care. Their coats were dull, their eyes showed white with fear, and they pressed themselves against the back walls of their stalls, as if trying to disappear. When the livery owner approached one stall with a bucket of grain, the horse inside screamed and struck out with its front hooves, connecting with the stall door hard enough to crack the wood. These animals weren't just scared, they were traumatized to the point of being dangerous. "How long have they been like this?" Caleb asked quietly. "Since they arrived 3 weeks ago," Whitmore replied. The train journey was a nightmare. There was a derailment in Nebraska, nothing serious, but the noise and chaos terrified them. By the time we got them here, they were wild with fear. I've had 4 different horse trainers look at them, and they all said the same thing, that these horses are broken beyond fixing and should be destroyed. The casual way Whitmore said destroyed made Caleb's jaw tighten. These were living creatures, not property to be discarded when they became inconvenient. He moved closer to the stalls, ignoring Whitmore's warning to be careful, and studied the horses with the eye of someone who had spent his life around them. They were magnificent animals under the fear and poor conditioning, tall and elegant with the refined features of generations of careful breeding, but their spirits were shattered, and rebuilding that would take time and patience that most people didn't have. "I can help them," Caleb said finally, "but it won't be quick, and I can't guarantee all 6 will come around. Some horses, when they're hurt badly enough, never fully recover." Whitmore's face lit with hope. "How long would you need?" "At least a month, maybe longer, and I'll need to work with them on my property, where there's space and quiet. Your livery is too confined, too close to town noise. They need room to remember their horses, not prisoners." The arrangements were made quickly. Whitmore would pay Caleb $2 up front and 3 more when the horses were gentle enough to be moved to his ranch. Additionally, he would cover the cost of feed and any supplies Caleb needed. The livery owner, clearly relieved to be rid of his dangerous boarders, offered to help transport them to Caleb's property. By late afternoon, 6 traumatized thoroughbreds stood in Caleb's newly repaired corral, pressed together in a nervous huddle, their eyes rolling with fear at every sound and movement. The Mustang observed the new arrivals from the rise with obvious interest. As the sun began to set and the men from town departed, she made her way down to the corral and positioned herself outside the fence, just watching. The thoroughbreds noticed her immediately, their heads coming up, their nostrils flaring as they caught her scent. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then slowly, one of the mares, a bay with a white blaze, moved toward the fence, where the Mustang stood. Caleb watched from the porch, hardly daring to breathe. The 2 mares touched noses through the fence rails, breathing each other's scent in the ancient equine greeting. The Mustang nickered softly, a sound of reassurance, and the thoroughbred's ears flicked forward, the first sign of curiosity rather than fear that Caleb had seen from any of them. One by one, the other thoroughbreds approached the fence, drawn by the Mustang's calm presence. She stood patiently, letting them investigate, and something in her bearing seemed to communicate that this place was safe, that the human who lived here could be trusted. It was then that Caleb understood the true gift the Mustang had given him. She hadn't just shown him the spring and shared his fire during storms. She had taught him, through her own gradual acceptance, how to earn trust rather than demand it, how to give space while remaining present, how to see animals not as things to be controlled, but as individuals making their own choices about how to interact with the world. These lessons, learned over weeks of patient observation and respect, were exactly what he needed to help the traumatized thoroughbreds find their way back to wholeness. The work of healing 6 traumatized thoroughbreds proved to be the most challenging and rewarding thing Caleb had ever undertaken. For the first week, he simply sat near the corral for hours each day, never approaching, never demanding, just being present while the horses grew accustomed to him. The Mustang spent much of that time nearby as well, her calm presence seeming to reassure the frightened thoroughbreds that this human was different from the ones who had caused their terror. During the second week, Caleb began moving inside the corral, still not approaching the horses directly, but occupying the same space, letting them grow comfortable with his movements and voice. He talked to them constantly, not about anything in particular, just letting the sound of his voice become familiar and unthreatening. 3 of the horses, including the bay mare who had first approached the Mustang, began showing interest, moving closer when he entered, though they would still bolt if he made any sudden movements. The breakthrough came on a cold January morning when Caleb arrived at the corral to find the Mustang inside it. She had somehow jumped the fence during the night and now stood among the thoroughbreds as if she had always belonged there. The other horses had arranged themselves around her, not touching but close, drawing comfort from her presence. When Caleb approached, the Mustang walked toward him, and the bay mare followed, then another, until he found himself surrounded by horses who were finally beginning to remember that humans could be something other than sources of fear. From that day forward, progress accelerated. Caleb used the Mustang as a bridge, working with her while the thoroughbreds watched, showing them through example that touch could be gentle, that humans could be trusted. He started with the bay mare, spending hours each day simply stroking her neck and speaking softly until she began to relax under his hands. The others watched and learned, and gradually, one by one, they began to accept his presence, his touch, and finally, his leadership. By the end of the month, 5 of the 6 horses were gentle enough to be haltered and led. The 6th, a high-strung chestnut gelding, remained fearful, and Caleb reluctantly told Whitmore that this one might never fully recover. But when Whitmore came to see the progress, he was astounded by the transformation in the other 5. They stood calmly while Caleb moved among them, and the bay mare even nickered when she saw him, a sound of greeting rather than fear. "You've performed a miracle," Whitmore said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was told these horses were beyond saving, that I should cut my losses and start over, but you saw something in them that no one else could see." Caleb shook his head. "I didn't do this alone." He gestured toward the Mustang, who stood watching from outside the corral. "She did most of the work. She showed them it was safe to trust again." The final payment from Whitmore, combined with what Caleb had saved, was enough to pay his taxes, with money left over for spring supplies and even a few more head of cattle. But more valuable than the money was the reputation he had earned. Word spread quickly through the territory about the poor cowboy who had gentled 6 unmanageable thoroughbreds, using nothing but patience and a wild Mustang. Within weeks, people were seeking him out, asking if he could help with their difficult horses, offering payment that seemed generous to someone who had been counting pennies just months before. Spring arrived with the suddenness that characterized Wyoming weather, winter's grip breaking almost overnight to reveal grass greening and wildflowers beginning to bloom. Caleb stood on his porch, surveying property that looked nothing like the wreck he had purchased for $14. The house was sound now, the barn repaired, the fences strong. The 3 steers Mitchell had loaned him had thrived, and he had purchased 3 more with his earnings. The chickens were laying again, and he had plans to add a vegetable garden near the spring. But the most significant change was in him. The desperate, broke cowboy who had gambled everything on an abandoned property had become a man with purpose, with skills that were valued, with a future that stretched before him full of possibility. He had found not just a home, but a calling, working with horses that others had given up on, giving them the same patient understanding that the Mustang had taught him. Speaking of the Mustang, she had never left. Even after the thoroughbreds were gone, even after she had surely fulfilled whatever instinct or need had kept her close, she remained. She still used her bedroom in the house, still followed him on his trips to town, still stood watch over the property as if it were hers to protect. The difference was that now she would come when he called, would nuzzle his hand for treats, would stand patiently while he brushed her coat until it gleamed like silver in the sunlight. People asked him constantly why he didn't break her properly, why he didn't put a saddle on her and ride her like any normal horse. His answer was always the same: she wasn't his to break. She had chosen to stay, and that choice was precious precisely because it was freely made. The Mustang had given him everything: companionship when he was alone, purpose when he was lost, and lessons about trust and patience that had changed his life. The least he could do was honor her freedom. On a warm May evening, as Caleb sat on his porch watching the sun set over land that was truly his, the Mustang approached and stood beside him. He reached up and stroked her neck, marveling as he always did at the softness of her coat and the trust implicit in her presence. A year ago, he had been broke and desperate, with nothing but $14 and fading hope. Now he had a home, a livelihood, and a partnership with a wild horse that had proven more valuable than anything money could buy. The prairies stretched out before them, vast and beautiful under the evening sky, and Caleb felt a contentment settle over him that he had never known was possible. He had learned that sometimes the best things in life came not from striving and grasping, but from patience and respect. That trust earned was more valuable than obedience demanded, and that a wild Mustang living in an abandoned farmhouse could teach a broke cowboy everything he needed to know about survival, success, and the kind of freedom that came from choosing to stay when you could have run. The Mustang nickered softly, as if agreeing with his thoughts, and together they watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, two survivors who had found in each other exactly what they needed to thrive.